Hello. Welcome, everyone, and thanks for coming out on a weekend to hear something that is at least partially work. This lecture recital is called 6 Serenades, Sound, Sense, and Sex in the 19th Century. Voice, in the period between 1825 and 1850, became more than just part of difference in sex and gender. It took on a structural role in determining gender and in how that gender could be represented on stage. This transformation becomes most visible in the context of the serenade, not the instrumental genre, but in the sense of a vocal piece sung below the beloved's window. This dramatic situation and the musical conventions that it elicited in the early 19th century corresponded in meaningful ways to highly gendered models of aesthetic experience in contemporary philosophy. Without reducing the serenade to encoding of philosophy and sound, because as I shall argue, the serenade of this period barely has content at all, I seek to use its proximity to gendered ideas in 19th century aesthetics as a means to examine how voice was gendered in performance. The importance of the serenade derives from two intersections with the philosophy of the early 19th century. Most foundational, it's a literal enactment of a structure that undergirds most 19th century accounts of aesthetic experience: men looking up at women as a method for self-actualization. We find this from Friedrich Schiller to Richard Wagner, and it's grounded in a traditional patriarchal masculine reason, feminine feeling system of philosophy that ultimately derives from St. Paul's account of transfiguration in the first epistle to the Corinthians. The second epistle to the Corinthians. And this aesthetic contemplation of the feminine has the power to qualitatively improve humanity, for Schiller at least. Quote, "The human in his physical state simply suffers the force of nature. He rids himself of this force in the aesthetic state, and he rules it in the moral." Unquote. So by the 19th century, Paul's model of biblical interpretation has been secularized and it has been gendered to a degree that's not present in the original biblical text. That is, now, in the 19th century, the self, which is implicitly masculine, gazes on a beautiful other, implicitly feminine, and is elevated. So Don Giovanni, who doesn't do much else but look at women, therefore became an important symbol to the Romantics, which is why I began with his serenade in Mozart's opera. Quote, "There is indeed nothing here on earth more exalting for the inner nature of man than love. It is love that so secretly and powerfully effective disturbs and transfigures the innermost aspects of existence. Small wonder, then, that Don Juan hoped to still, in love, the longing that burned in his heart." That's E.T.A. Hoffmann, who is articulating a vision of Don Giovanni that is substantially foreign to Mozart's opera's ideas. But precisely because it sits uneasily on top of the opera that it's claiming to interpret, the Hoffmann's ideas about Don Giovanni reveal more of themselves and the contradictions inherent to them than perhaps were intended. There are rifts to see through in his vision of romantic masculinity, open wounds that we can examine, even as Hoffmann tries to close them up with the bandage of the serenade. So, in Mozart's opera, the protagonist, or central figure at very least, is the monster of the Enlightenment. He escapes all human justice precisely because he is an ignoble nobleman, which is such a contradiction in terms that Don Ottavio, his only social equal in the opera, and therefore the only hope his victims have for earthly vengeance, is basically unable to comprehend it. And while Don Giovanni clearly cares little for the outward niceties of his class, he is not exactly liberated from social roles either. In fact, he weaponizes them. Throughout the opera, he intentionally victimizes only his inferiors by birth or by social class, and he assiduously attempts to avoid confrontations with other elite men, though it's worth pointing out that he fails rather spectacularly in the case of the Commendatore. The Romantic writers, who are mostly elite men, and in fairness to them are on the other side of no small social and aesthetic upheaval, But being mostly elite men, they are much like Don Ottavio in their understanding of Don Giovanni. They allow the markers of social aristocracy to convince them of a non-existent inner nobility. Hoffmann's Don is not an abyssal social contradiction, but a doomed individual paragon, as he says. Nature equipped Don Juan as if he were her favorite child, with all that raises man towards divinity, a powerful, handsome body, a personality radiating the spark which kindles the most sublime feelings in the soul, a profound sensibility, a quick, instinctive understanding. Basically, educated and well-nourished, and therefore sensitive and charismatic. The tragedy for Hoffmann in that case is just that this capacity for transcendence is misdirected. It's through this exceptionalism that, quote, the devil slipped the noose around his neck. The thought came into Don Juan's mind, he elaborates, that through love, through the enjoyment of women, that there could be already fulfilled on earth that which dwells only as a heavenly prophecy in our breast, and even as that infinite longing which sets us in immediate contact with the celestial. This sends him, quote, fleeing restlessly from one beautiful woman to another more beautiful one, unquote. So basically the problem for Hoffmann is that Don Giovanni mistook the sign, sex, for the divine signified of transcendence, union of masculine and feminine, etc., etc. And therefore he was unfaithful and flighty rather than seeking out the one woman who, in the words of the end of Goethe's Faust, could draw him upwards. Soren Kierkegaard, who is the other great 19th century philosopher of Don Giovanni, would later explicitly contrast Don Giovanni and Faust as the two basic types of seducer, not in the highest stage of life, but part of the dialectical ascent towards it in his system of philosophy. Don Giovanni is therefore sort of an admirable figure to the Romantics, not in his actions really, but in his potential. And the Romantic models of heroism, especially the Byronic hero, such as his improbably pronounced Don Juan, and I'm not kidding, that's literally how you're supposed to say it, Byron's heroes are arguably defined by wasted potential. This is a metaphorical onanism that becomes quite literal in the case of Don Juan stories. Yet, on the other hand, there are major issues with German Romanticism itself, if you're going to read Don Giovanni as in some ways romantically actualized. What is a human, asks Schiller, quote, before beauty charms uncontrolled passion from him, and the calm form soothes his wild life, forever uniform in his aims, forever changing in his judgments, selfish without a self to be, unbound without free to be, a slave without a rule to serve. And that might be a miniature character study for Don Giovanni, who compulsively pursues women but is unable to remain faithful, who's self-evidently selfish, but who changes his musical style to imitate everyone else, who is driven by a compulsiveness that ultimately finds its expression in an unordered list. Leporello's observation that Don Giovanni, quote, makes conquests of old women for the pleasure of adding them to the list, unquote, is the only phrase in the entire catalog that indicates some kind of enjoyment. It's the list, this list of women, that is precisely the problem that attaches to these positive interpretations of Don Giovanni. Because this represents the other place for the infinite in the opera, not just the infinite that you can ascend to at the window. Kierkegaard picks up on this. He notes the odd and accidental quality of the number 1003, which suggests its perpetual augmentation. But the list, as I mentioned, is unordered. Leporello tries to describe some categories, but their proliferation is proof that they don't work. He totals it up by nationality, by hair color, by social status, body type, age. But in the end, the only rule he can give is, if she wears a skirt, you know what he does. As there is no rule, all the women belong equally on the list and are therefore exactly the same. But as there is no rule, none of them have anything in common and are therefore entirely different. This kind of infinity that is represented by simply adding and adding is going to defy logical operation beyond simply adding more. Kierkegaard therefore considers that Don Giovanni's life is, quote, the sum of repellent moments which have no coherence. His life as moment is the sum of the moments, as the sum of the moments is the moment. Which is more or less, it all comes out to the same thing in the end. One more. Kierkegaard here is drawing on a particular distinction in Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel's discussion of the infinite in the Science of Logic. This is between true infinity, das wahre Unendliche, and what is conventionally translated as spurious infinity, das schlechte Unendliche, which literally means bad infinity. Bad infinity is determined by being the limit of the finite, and therefore is not truly infinite. And for Hegel, it's this infinite series, n plus 1, that is the embodiment of bad infinity, which is always going to remain only an ought to be, and if you're following along in German, that's ein sollen. It doesn't lead one upwards, but it stalls all movement in the continual search for one more. Thank you for bearing with that entire philosophical excursus, because it all gets activated in De Vieni alla Finestra. The redemptive potential of the serenade has to be broken. It has to be quantized, in Hegelian terms, into part of the infinite series, because otherwise it would threaten to elevate and transfigure Don Giovanni, which would break him free of the second meeting he has with the Commendatore, and that's been inevitable since the first bars of the overture. It's an opera about the libertine punished, as the original title reads, or Don Giovanni. Mozart, of course, is pre-Hegelian and has his own motivations, but he serves this purpose perfectly well as well by allowing Don Giovanni to sing some of the song to Donna Elvira, rather than her maid, who it's addressed to in the aria, by allowing Don Giovanni to sing some of it to somebody else in the preceding number. This depersonalizes the serenade. Critically, it does so by adding a verse and suggesting that the serenade itself might be an infinite series, the same song to each woman on the list, roughly 2006 verses long. So our romantic serenade is starting from a context that says too much repetition is bad. With that in mind, let's move to the actual 19th century and a piece that I might like you to think of as an ideal serenade. And we'll talk about what that means after we hear it.
Mit in die Lust
Part 2, Ideal Serenades and Serenade Idealism. Musicology has given little formal attention to the vocal serenade of the 19th century. The term has, instead, migrated to the instrumental tradition that dates to the 18th century. Musicians and music scholars, of course, normally pick up a practical idea of what a vocal serenade is, but as far as I am aware, there is no satisfactory, rigorous definition. Some scholars have reached for etymology, but that is not much use. Its derivation from the Italian sera would suggest that a serenade must take place in the evening. But many serenades are set in the early morning. For example, Ecco ridente in cielo from Gioacchino Rossini's Barber of Seville. Ecco ridente and its early morning contemporaries are not a separate genre. They are still very much what in Greek is called paraklasideron, a song before the beloved's closed door. Similarly, the German stenchen is not derived from sera and makes no temporal distinction. Although Germanophone composers were, of course, aware of the Italian etymology, in practice, one generally sees the terms Abend and Morgen stenchen when they care to make a temporal distinction. While for lack of a conventional and time-neutral English term, I continue to use serenade, I mean something much closer to paraklasideron or stenchen, and emphasize identifying it by situation and form rather than time of day, though I should point out that broad daylight is kind of unlikely. I treat the serenade as a topos in the sense defined by Leonard Ratner, part of, quote, a thesaurus of characteristic figures, unquote, that will use specific musical gestures to index a social context. I also simultaneously use topos and figure in the sense of Roland Barthes, for whom the topos is, quote, a somewhat empty place offering outlined figures that provoke the auditor's recognition of their own experience. That experience will then provide the content that the topos lacks, and this is therefore a way one can speak universally of such an individualized experience as love. This frame is useful because the serenade topos is an aggregate of qualities, no single one of which is actually required. But representations of singing beneath a window and before a closed door, either explicitly, as in a staged opera, or implied in the lyrics, consistently evoked a certain limited set of musical choices across multiple composers and generations. We can therefore imagine an ideal serenade that has all of them. I will quantify these characteristics as follows. First, strophic form, eventually of two strophes only. Earlier, that is, pre-1830s serenades, more frequently have three or occasionally more strophes. Late 19th century serenades will often add a coda of sorts to make an AAB form, but in the period that's my focus between 1830 and 1850, you see a lot of AA. Two repetitions. Many serenades, in addition to this, contain additional sub-repetitions within the verse itself, including false beginnings. Second, the presence or imitation of an improvisatory diegetic instrument, that is, an instrument that exists in the world of the serenade and we're supposed to assume, is being played by the serenader. So this accompanies the singing, and this might be considerably abstracted, for example, to a staccato plucked string texture, or to repeated ground bass or ritornello-like musical elements. Third, exoticism, originally Spanish, but in the 19th century, Venice and eventually all of Italy become increasingly common settings for a serenade as well. Fourth, a preference for meters that are heard as compound, usually notated as a fast 3/4 that's felt in 1, or a slow 6/8. Fanny Hensel's Gondolied, which I just sang, has all of these characteristics. Other serenades on the program lack one or the other, but it's recognizably the same topos. So if it sounds like I'm just singing the same song 6 times, good. In a sense, I am. While not a musical choice, it's also characteristic for the lyrics to explicitly ask only for the beloved's appearance, rather than a more tangible benefit, like a confession of love, a promise to meet again, admission to the house, sex, etc. All of that is frequently only metonymically implied. The consistency is even more striking here because of the general state of serenade lyrics. They're not very good. They generally draw from a fairly unstructured, interchangeable, limited pool of cliches. In fact, asking for more than a look is generally a pretty frequent cue for the serenade to go off the rails in a comic situation. For example, Johannes Brahms' Vergebliches Ständchen, or the trio A Taci in Giusto Core from Don Giovanni that precedes the serenade proper. After all, if the woman moves, or actually really does anything, you can't look up at her, which is critical to the philosophical structure that the serenade is deriving from German idealism. The strophic form, which seems to have struck most romantics as an awkward but important anachronism that required constant adjustment or compromise, is by far the fastest evolving component of the serenade topos. Late 18th century and early 19th century serenades are invariably strophic, but they're free with the number of strophes, and there's one by Carl Maria von Weber that has 10, and I'm not singing that today. You can all thank me later. Serenades from 1825 to 1850 are much more likely to have only 2 strophes, as I mentioned. During this period, opera composers, especially from Donizetti to Wagner, embraced this form with a historically unusual frequency and strictness. Song composers of this period wrote fewer serenades, and they were more experimental when they did write one, though some did, even in song, adhere to the 2-strophe pattern. In particular, songs of this period occasionally add a form of coda to the 2 strophes, as in certain serenade lieder of Schubert and Robert Schumann. It seems likely to me that as a culture of vocal ornamentation disappeared, the repetition of 3 or more strophes came to be too much. However, some level of repetition continued to be necessary throughout the period in order to evoke a serenade at all. The imitation diegetic accompaniment is essentially constant across the long 19th century, as is the strong but not exclusive preference for compound or quasi-compound meter. While the horizon for the exoticized location expands as the 19th century goes on, from Spain to Venice to the rest of Italy, its basic treatment as local color to give some unique material to the otherwise rather deprived poetry also remains unchanged. So let's turn to an early 3-strophe serenade. Part 3, repetition. The expectation that a serenade have multiple strophes was apparently quite powerful. After Schubert's death, that setting of the one-verse serenade from Shakespeare's Cymbeline, which makes use of other parts of the serenade topos, such as the prominent ritornello and 6/8 time signature, was expanded to 3, the words to the latter 2 by Friedrich Schreil for the second edition. German romantics generally don't mess with Shakespeare for no reason. So these repetitions are serving as a genre marker. But using repetition as a genre marker causes problems for the romantic understanding of serenades, since the strophic serenade, especially one where you can just keep adding strophes, has the same problem as Don Giovanni's list: non-teleological, bad infinity, n+1. This can be heard in the music and is not merely an abstract philosophical thing. Especially because of the frequency of sub-repetitions within a strophe, the serenade topos can threaten to loosen or even undo the forward momentum of common practice harmony, both formally and on the very local level of the individual chord. But there's other forms of repetition beyond the extra strophes. So a little light music theory now. Annotated copies of this score are available if you would like to refer to them. And note that these scores and this analysis are in my key of B flat, because that's the one I had, a whole step down from the original published key of C major. So within the strophe, after a periodic diatonic setting of the first half of the text, Schubert proceeds to a half cadence with a secondary dominant, and that should be at the bottom of the front of your page. He then resumes in the key of flat 6, the only real chromatic excursion of the piece. The music builds in tension until it is released back to the home key through a German augmented 6th chord. Melodically, this moment of harmonic release features an occurrence of the highest note in the piece, a foreshadowed arpeggiated gesture, sharpening of D flat to D, which evokes a move from minor to major in the home key, and it occurs on a word, reizend, charming, that is both phonologically and semantically appropriate. It's a little masterclass in song climax. Which is all very well, but then Schubert does it again, 4 measures later. And since I sang Rail's 2 verses as well, you all got to experience this singular moment of fulfillment no less than 6 times in under 4 minutes. Which does kind of defeat the point. Instead of allowing the chromaticism and the augmented 6 to signify a place in a hierarchy of phrases and cadences, the piece as performed features a multiplicity of interchangeable climaxes that reject hierarchical organization. Formally, the repetition of text also creates an imbalance and loss of temporal clarity by allowing the second 4 poetic lines to grow out of musical proportion with the first 4. Nor does this repetition align with other typical ways of producing formal teleology in a piece, such as long-range counterpoint. This entire section that I just called the climax of the piece is pretty easy to just cut entirely in a Schenkerian background analysis, though for Chris's sake, I'll spare you all. This repetition signifies the serenade genre, clearly, but it doesn't clarify the structure of the piece, as repeating the exposition might in sonata form, for example. Instead, the serenade repetitions are occluding and confusing typical long-range musical structures. So here's another example. In the Berlioz piece, the strophe is also internally repetitive, which can confuse the listener about where we are in the form, since only some repetitions of the first theme will introduce a new strophe.
Maintenant, chantons à cette belle chanson morale pour la perdre, plaisir-amour. Devant la maison de celui qui t'adore, de celui qui t'adore, petite luison que fait-il de l'aurore, que
Part 4, repetition. A genre marked by repetition, above all strophic repetition, thus creates problems for a purely musical discourse in an aesthetic environment which requires that artistic discourse be teleological. This is not generally a practical issue for strophic song, as the discourse of vocal music is not purely musical. As Caroline Abate notes, there is a similar subtle conflict in strophic narrative music, since, quote, the verses, by remaining similar, by repeating, in some sense deny the progressive sequence of changing events of the narrative. More overtly, however, the monotony of rhyme, meter, and strophe forces the reader-listener to fix on the meaning of the words and not their sound, to listen to the story, unquote. That works very well for the ballads, the narrative songs that Abate is working with. But what about the serenade, which has no narrative, no story, and all too often, barely even a novel or striking image to the poetry? The serenade is, and I keep stressing this because it's very true, a cliched genre. Oh, come to the window, you're beautiful, I'm in love, we can repeat this until we run out of strophes. The words in the serenade are another form of monotony whose role is to direct the attention elsewhere. That is, in the serenade, neither the music nor the poetry is capable of forward momentum. But as we just argued, the serenade must acquire that teleological forward momentum, because the dramatic situation, singing below the window, is an enactment of that same aesthetic structure that's supposed to get you up to transcendence, and is therefore demanding the teleology in the first place. And what's left is only the act itself, the outlined figures of Barthes' amorous topos that have no content, but are the lover at work. Indeed, the serenade can be read much as Barthes describes the archetypal love letter. Quote, I have nothing to tell you, except that it's to you I tell this nothing. The serenade is affirming only that it's a serenade. The proof that the singer is in love and sincere is recursive. Believe me, I'm in love. I'm serenading you. Listen to my serenade. It's inspired by love. The serenade comes to signify, I have nothing to sing to you, save that it is to you I sing this nothing. Song, and voice, really, is therefore not only a medium, but its own content. If it can signify, I am here singing to you, then it must be able to signify I am and here. That is to say, identity, existence, and immediacy. Voice itself, and not merely as a medium for words, is, in the serenade model, what ascends to its destination. And therefore, the serenade model demands that voice, specifically, stand in as a metonymy for the self. But that self is already gendered masculine by the same model, because women don't get to sing serenades in this period. When the woman sings, as in Brahms' Vergebliche Ständchen, the serenade is in vain, vergeblich, and the song becomes a comic scene and a deconstruction. Comic incident and failure are associated with a sung response, even when the serenade itself is taken seriously, as in the two Barbers of Seville of Peziello and Rossini. So this association between voice and self may seem obvious to us today. The philosopher Adriana Cavarero, for example, argues that the voice is, quote, that which alone is capable of attesting to the uniqueness of each human being. And it's conventional also to link the voice with the soul as far back as Aristotle, which relies for the most part on that passage of On the Soul that states that, quote, the voice is the sound produced by a creature possessing a soul, empsiku is that word, put a pin in it, for inanimate things never have a voice, unquote. But as Bonnie Gordon has argued, simply categorizing the voice as a spiritual emanation sits poorly with broader Aristotelian ideas of soul and matter. And moreover, Aristotle's soul, the psyche, is not directly constitutive of a self. In the Politics, he refers to the enslaved as empsychon in the same sentence that he denies their personhood. A slave is alive, empsychon, article of property. For Aristotle, people whom he considers to be, quote, slaves, do not possess many aspects of a self, including gender, incidentally. They can be male and female, but not men and women. As we might expect, when we return to the example of recognition by voice, this is not imagined in Aristotle's otherwise exhaustive catalog of the means for recognition in his Poetics. I can't confidently claim that there is no recognition by voice ever in all of ancient Greek literature, because I'm not a classicist. But a list of pointed counterexamples where there's a very notable non-recognition of a speaker who somebody kind of ought to recognize, a close friend or a family member, is really very trivial to assemble. And this is unsurprisingly true of early operatic literature too, considering the prevalence of classical models in that. You might see it first in Le Nozze di Figaro, that's an early example, where Figaro can recognize Susanna's voice and see through her disguise, but it's restricted to Figaro and Susanna, who are uniquely clever and uniquely in love. Both Cherubino and the Count have extended exchanges with the Countess, thinking that she is Susanna, despite the Countess's general inability to conceal the curlicues and coloratura of her aristocratic, opera seria-influenced vocal style. Lorenzo da Ponte actually seems to have liked voice recognition. It's in Don Giovanni as well, where Don Giovanni himself gets recognized briefly by his voice. But these cases are very few, and it's not a coincidence that the examples I can find are all from the socially minded Mozart da Ponte operas. Absolutist political thought generally avoided the individual as a unit, except in the case of the monarch. Identity was instead constituted by overlapping memberships in various groups. But by the time we get to 1848 and the revolutions, and, say, Rigoletto of 1851, recognition by voice is unexplained, unerring, and unexceptional. Rigoletto recognizes the Duke off stage and knows that he's killed the wrong person. For Verdi, voice is an unexceptional way one could recognize the offstage Duke, and not as the Duke, which might have theoretically been possible in the absolutist system, because this is an expression, La Donna Mobile, his song, is an expression of his private tastes. So what I'm saying here is that there's a new capacity by about 1850 for vocal recognition. And this greater capacity for recognition and for vocal selfhood, that the voice can be the self, also attaches directly to the operatic serenade in this period, after about approximately 1830. In Halévy's La Juive, for example, the serenade is directly followed by a recognition, and Rachel explicitly mentions recognizing Leopold's voice. In Don Pasquale, Ernesto is indicated to sing from off stage, so not only can his girlfriend Norina recognize him by voice alone in his serenade Come Gentile, the audience is expected to as well. It is only in Damnation de Faust that this recognition fails, because Marguerite becomes under the impression that the singer was not Mephistopheles but Faust. However, this is due to the former's appropriately diabolical deceptions. Prior to the 1830s, however, this association of serenade and recognition does not seem to have existed. These serenades take place in scenes of introduction, deception, and genuinely mistaken identity. To compare only Rossini and Donizetti, Norina in Don Pasquale is able to effortlessly recognize what Rosina in Barber of Seville has to spend the entire opera trying to figure out: the identity of the man singing the serenade outside her window. And after 1850, things change as well. First, an example. Final part, dissolution and invoicing. Beyond 1850, the repetitions of serenade form often dissolve altogether. In addition, it does return to popularity in the 1870s and 80s, in song mostly, not opera, after a low couple of decades. But more and more frequently, it's the subject of deconstruction and parody, especially when it's outside of an exoticized context. It's often framed as a quotation of a character within a broader narrative song. That is, the strophic serenade became old-fashioned, requiring a specific context, frame, or even apology. And the AAB coda model, too, as you heard in the last piece, becomes more common. This aspect of identity formation, I want to stress, is historically contingent. The long 18th century serenades that don't deal with recognition don't have the same sort of philosophical baggage. The post-1850 serenades that are shaking off the formal constraints of the topos, unless it's ironic or exoticized, no longer really feel a need to explicitly confirm the equation of the voice with the self, because it was secure by that period. But in this period of the 1830s and 1840s, transnationally, the serenading voice was the principal means for establishing an individual vocal identity, as opposed to membership in a group. This process, however, inevitably encountered the fact that the serenade was already gendered masculine. A crucial part of the complex of meaning that created the voice as individual was the passive, implicitly feminine object that both elicited and recognized the serenade, but who could not fill that role and simultaneously herself have a voice of that type. In considering how women of this period then made their voices heard in performance, we can't simply import analytical tools that were devised for later eras, when aspects of industrialized modernity that were emergent in the 1850s and the 1830s had become more fully entrenched. Such, for example, is Caroline Abate's now classic essay, Opera or the Invoicing of Women, which hears the prima donna's song as usurping, in some measure, the traditional authority of the nearly always male opera composer's voice. So this composer's voice is already metaphorical, but the prima donna's voice is too, the minute we go beyond vibrations in the opera house and begin to hear it as some kind of authoritative statement, the I of I made this. That is, when it takes the same form as the serenade and affirms only its own identity, existence, and immediacy. To conclude, in the 1830s and 1840s, it became possible to identify the stuff of a singer's voice, not merely their use of it, with their individual self. But this existed only within gendered limits. This process is most visible in the sudden proliferation of serenade forms in opera of that period, because of the serenade's resistance to other, more traditional forms of meaning, and its resonance with long-standing aesthetic metaphors. When the identification of voice and self became more secure, serenade forms passed out of favor, frequently being subverted or even parodied in song after 1850. However, as serenades were understood as highly gendered, the voice functioned very differently for men and women. The effusions of pure voice in men's serenades proclaimed who they were to these audiences. Such singing could not serve the same purpose for women. The model of vocal selfhood developing in the 1830s and 40s then was gendered in both its structural conception and its practical instantiation. Thank you all, and I'd like to leave you with one last serenade. questions, or if you would prefer, we can do questions outside. There are cookies. I think we're here for cookies. Okay.